Okay, hi everybody. I'm. Can you hear me? So I'm Rahul from Bromium Labs, and first of all, thank you for taking time out. I know after lunch it's and a long night of partying. It's not easy to come back for a lunch presso. So I hope I have something interesting which will keep everybody awake until the end of the presentation. And and the horse that you see here, hopefully by the end of the presentation you will see Sandboxes look something very similar like that horse, right? This is my first time in DerbyCon and I'm absolutely loving it here. Awesome crowd, great people. It's just been awesome. Thank you everybody. So just a little bit about myself. So I kind of joined this startup called Bromium a couple of years back early on. Before this, I was leading McAfee vulnerability research, worldwide research, basically, essentially every 0 days and all of that stuff. I have done startups before. My first startup was early on in 2000. Before Snort, I kind of built an IDS kind of technology. And then we just launched Bromium Labs a couple of months back, just before Black Hat Vegas. And this is kind of our first research paper we have published. And hopefully we'll do many more going forward, and hopefully you'll get some good press about us. And that's the only marketing slide I have in this slide deck, I promise. And yes, I'm hiring, by the way. So sandboxes certainly seem to be an interesting topic, mainly because what's happening is nothing else seems to be working, right? So people are looking at like why not sandboxes, right? So I mean, sandboxes are a good piece of technology. It's been there for 10 years now, and so what I'll do is I'll kind of take every sandbox in the market, like all the big names, Google Chrome, Adobe Reader, Sandboxy, whatever is there, and then we'll do a architectural decomposition of each of the sandbox, and then towards the end we'll do live exploits to bypass all of these sandboxes, like by design, looking at the architectural flaws which cannot be fixed in most cases, right? Some serious stuff, yeah. So to start off, what is a sandbox, right? So a sandbox is essentially I would say it's the primitives designed to isolate code such that in case that code is an exploit or malware, it remains contained within that zone, right? It's kind of used as an anti-exploitation technology on browsers like Chrome. Microsoft is building their own sandbox as well. So the whole idea is to isolate threads, right? And so we look at how robust is this technology in terms of being on the Windows operating system. And then I'll be focused on application sandboxes. So no Java this time. Let's Java mature a bit and behave like a sandbox. Then we'll bring Java in the party, but not now. So we'll take these sandboxes, which is Sandboxy, Buffer Zone, and then recently Dell introduced a product called DDP. I don't know what that means, but it's a sandbox. And then the most popular, Adobe Reader, Google Chrome, and I call it the master-slave model. I don't know how many people like that terminology, but I like it, so I use it basically. So we divide the talk into two main categories of sandboxes, Type A and Type B. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the boring details of how each type works from an architecture point of view, right? Before we get into the cool stuff. So before we get into sandboxes, a little bit about Windows internals and Windows operating system at a very high level, right? So we all know the Windows OS is divided into two main components, which is like the user mode, which has all the cool services, SVC host, CSRSS, and whatnot running, which are essential for the operating system to run. And then you have the Windows kernel, which is like several million lines of code of attack surface, right? All of these are juicy things from an attacker's point of view, right? So every time you do any activity, right? So we just don't realize, but how much we depend on the kernel for pretty much everything, because kernel has been designed to optimize code execution. So most of the code is there. Every file handle, everything interaction you encounter, the kernel is pretty much running the show, right? So a vulnerability in the kernel is pretty much means game over for any technology, right? So this is how it works. If you have an kernel mode based sandbox, this is how the access control will look like. So the sandbox application will say, dear kernel, please open a file for me, and the file name is at address X. The kernel says, it points to that, yeah, it's an allowed file. It could be an API, which is allowing. And here goes the file handle for you. And then the sandbox application can open the file. Now the sandbox application says, dear kernel, please open a file for me, and the file is at address Y, and the kernel will say, this is a secret file or an API, and then you don't have access, so the kernel will deny you access. So this is how it works at a high level, right? To make it more interesting, how many of you have heard of the TrueType font? It's one of the coolest things Microsoft ever built. It gave birth to the DQ worm, and I'm sure many more yet to come. So for some reason, Microsoft added font parsing in the kernel, which is not a very smart move, I would say, but I think they will change it pretty soon. I heard Windows 8 might make some changes around that. So supposing you want to open a font file, and you say that, I want to draw this text hello world using a TrueType font at address X. The kernel will say, you are a sandbox app, but using a font is benign because the kernel has no way to know that the font is good or bad, right? So the kernel has to allow the font to be opened, right? Which means that, okay, hang on, I'll give you access to the font, but I need to parse the font first, right? So while parsing the font, the kernel encounters a memory corruption issue, for instance, and then because the kernel code is buggy, and then from there onwards you have access to the address X, and you can do pretty much anything you want, right? This is how some of the indie wild malware exploiting font vulnerabilities have been discovered, exactly doing this at a very high level, right? So so this is like a kind of a precursor to what I'm going to do next. Basically, the type A sandboxes are essentially kernel mode drivers, which is basically designed to contain the behavior of the application inside the sandbox, and then it allows and prevents based on how the driver has been designed, right? And most of these are actually used for control execution of applications. A lot of people use this for safe browsing. Bad idea. So, and I'll explain why in a bit. And you know what? Some people are brave. They use Sandboxy for malware analysis. Really bad idea. So this is how, if I create a block diagram of Sandboxes, this is how it looks like. So it's a kernel mode driver, right? And then a sandbox process has, it's like a traffic policeman saying, you're allowed to access this API, you're not allowed to access this API, and so on, right? And then they have some user mode hooks to control applications and the behavior inside the sandbox container. So this is how pretty much any application sandbox looks like. I'm talking about all this variety of the type 1 Sandboxy, buffer zone, del DDP, all of these sandboxes are of the same type essentially. This is the design of an application sandbox. So, and then type B. So type B is far more sophisticated just because Google has millions of dollars to spend, right? So how it works is, this type of sandbox is pretty much based out of the Chromium project, which you might have heard about. It's been there for several years. It's a pretty well-established sandbox model. So how it works is that it has a master and a slave, and it talks over IPC channel. And the slave is using the OS access control facilities, and it is driven by the master. That's why I call it the master and the slave. But a lot of people call it the broker and something else. But I like master and slave because it is the master and that's the slave, right? So and the use case is to protect that specific application. So for instance, the sandbox of Google Chrome will protect only Google Chrome and not anything else. The type A is a generic sandbox container, but these are specialized application sandboxes designed for that particular application, right? And Adobe Reader and Google Chrome are the most widely used application sandboxes, I would say, right now in the world. So, and the design is this, so it's a very simple math, I would say. The master has a smaller code base, so that attacking, so which can, the smaller code base means that attacking the master is not easy, is non-trivial task. So it's basically, far more difficult to exploit it unless you know Pinkie Pie and and you're good friends with Pinkie Pie. That's an anomaly though. Have you heard of the Chrome exploit by Pinkie Pie? How many of you have heard? No? You should check it out. It's just awesome, kick-ass stuff. This was like a couple of years back, I think last year, Pawn to Own contest. So the slave has a bigger attack surface. So slave is where all the stuff happens. It's the renderer of the browser. It has HTML5. It has pretty much everything happening out there, right? And it is brokered by the master. And slave has direct access to the OS kernel. That's interesting. And then slave also has access to certain user mode components, which has not been disclosed publicly. Very few people know about this. And I will talk about some interesting stuff later on, why this is so interesting. Right. So as per the Chromium project, this is how the Chrome application sandbox looks like. So you have the master, which is brokering access to the slave via IPC. So you have a policy engine which kind of decides that this kind of accesses are allowed. This is the level of integrity. This is the level of how much a slave is allowed to do is controlled by the master, right? It's all documented. It's an open source project. It's a very cool project. You should check it out if you haven't. If you want to know about sandboxes. So the Chromium sandbox on Windows. So Chromium sandbox is not the Chrome browser. This is the Chromium project, which is used by Adobe and Google Chrome. So I'll kind of talk about the Chromium project first, and then I talk about the implementation of Google Chrome and Adobe Reader next, right? So basically, the design is the slave runs with low privileges, which means that even if you compromise the renderer, you cannot do much. And that's kind of the whole intention of the sandbox. You have restricted tokens, job objects, desktop object, and the integrity levels to control all of the accesses, basically, right? So some interesting thing as per the documentation, which is not very well known, is that if you have a mounted FAT or FAT32 partition, there is no protection from the sandbox. And similarly for TCP/IP, there is no protection in the Chromium public sandbox, right? So, and access to pretty much everything else is denied. And most people would say this is good enough. It's a pretty robust design, at least it looks like, right? So if you look at how it actually works, the PID 2856 out there is the slave, and 2808 is the master. So if a slave wants to access a particular resource, so in this case it is the netscan or DLL, it will send a request to the master saying that I need this access, and the master decides whether he has access or not, the slave has access or not, right? So as you can see, the first case it gets access denied, and then it requests the master duplicates a handle and passes it over to the slave, and then from there on the slave gets full access. This is how, and this is happening via named pipes, which is not visible in process monitor. Because process monitor doesn't show named pipes, it's just IPC mechanism. You can, if you have some IPC tools, you can actually see what's happening behind the scenes, behind each request by a sandbox. Right? So now the question is, how resistant is the master to a malicious slave? So this is what most of the people have been looking at in the past few years. So like last Pawn to Own contest, the Pawnium contest, people have been breaking out of the sandbox by trying to break out of the master. Right? But however, how resistant is an OS to a malicious slave? Right? If there's a vulnerability in the operating system, is it possible to leverage a vulnerable slave and break out of the master? That seems to be an interesting attack vector, right? So we kind of focus on this aspect, and I did this talk a little bit earlier at Black Hat Europe earlier in the year. Although this have had some new stuff which wasn't done earlier. So recently, MWR Labs won the Pontoon contest exactly with this attack vector, which is they found a kernel exploit, kernel 0-day, and they broke out of Chrome out of the kernel exploit, right? If the kernel is vulnerable, what can Google Chrome do? It's not their fault, right? So, so now I'll talk a little bit about the differences of how Adobe Reader and Google Chrome have implemented the Chromium sandbox in their applications. It's very interesting. There are very subtle differences, but they make a huge difference in the entire security model. And this also shows the sophistication level of each product, right? So first of all, Adobe Reader is low integrity, which means that pretty much all the resources are denied except for some networking, minimal accesses are allowed pretty much. It's all well documented in MSG and on if you are low integrity, what is allowed, what is not allowed, right? So again, you might have heard about the 0-day malware found, which was exploiting the Adobe Reader sandbox, and it was actually a bug in the master. That was a complex exploit to write. You know, there are easier ways to break out of the sandbox. But anyways, people have been working hard at breaking out of the master. And there is malware which exploits Adobe Reader, and which was actually a 0-day found in February, earlier this year, basically, right? So Chrome is far, far more sophisticated than Adobe Reader. They have done a lot of work for hardening their sandbox, and some of it is really cool stuff. For instance, they have something called the untrusted integrity level, which is pretty much, which completely locks you down pretty much, as opposed to the low integrity level, right? As you can see, everything is denied if you open the properties of the Chrome process, right? And even though the documentation of Chromium says that it has access to FAT32, but Google Chrome does not allow you that. It has completely been hardened, right? It is far, far more deprivileged. I would say it's the most deprivileged sandbox available in the industry right now. And it's pretty cool. A lot of work done there. And Pontoon and Ponium broke out of the master. And the exploits for breaking out of Chrome are very complex simply because of all the hard work done there. So now, have you heard of the BPF syscall filter on Linux? How many of you have heard of that? So that's a pretty cool project. So it has been designed exactly to limit this attack surface, right? So what we're talking about holistically is about the attack surface. How easy or difficult is it to protect your application? So if the attack surface is huge, it's more and more difficult, right? So the BPF syscall filter Linux actually allows you to limit your kernel accesses, and it's pretty nice architecture. And Chrome leverages that on Linux. So that's probably I would say, one of the most secure browsers on the Linux platform. However, Chrome has done a lot more work. For instance, if you inject into the renderer and you try to create a process, it denies that. Similarly, if you try to access some certain registry keys from the renderer, it denies that. So a lot more hardening has been done even to break exploits as a part of the second stage exploitation. However, win32k.sys, that's probably the hottest topic in the kernel world of Microsoft right now, is pretty much exposed, right? So any vulnerability in win32k.sys would mean a complete total bypass of the sandbox, right? And this is exactly what the Ponium guys did. They won a bounty because of vulnerability in the OS, right? So now let's talk about exploitation. So what I'll do now, I will break out of each of these sandboxes one by one, right, with different exploits. I will start with Sandboxy first, right? So how many of you are familiar with Sandboxy? Okay, so there are people who use Sandboxy. That's great. So last when I checked, there were like 200 million users who have visited their forums. I would assume that at least 5 million would be using them. That's pretty big. So let's see. So as you can see, I have opened command prompt, and what I'll do is I'll show you Sandboxy control, right? So as you can see, command prompt is running inside Sandboxy. So just to demonstrate that what I talked about the architecture, I will open a notepad out here, right? And from the sandbox, if I try to kill notepad, I'll get access denied because the kernel driver says I don't have access to that, right? So if I do task kill, it says access denied, right? So now let's have some fun. So now what I'll do is I'll run an exploit called actually I have a nice slide for my exploitation. Let me open that slide. I did some UI work there, so I should definitely show it off. So that's my sandbox pony, by the way. And those are all the kernel exploits in the last 18 months. And then I select this and you can see that's a happy pony there, right? Sandbox pony, yes. So now let's do the exploitation. Now the pony is risen up and we are all set, right? So what I do now is I run that exploit ms012. This is probably called as the systhread exploit, right? One of my colleagues who works with Chromium found this vulnerability, and so I actually exploit this vulnerability to break out of Sandboxy. And then what I do is that it's kind of we have created a generic pivot mechanism which will work across all sandboxes, right? Instead of changing my payload for each sandbox, we have created a generic pivot where what I do is that after I compromise the sandbox and I'm at the kernel, right? I have the privilege as that of the kernel, right? I have the privilege to either disable the sandbox driver or migrate to a different process and then do fun stuff, right? So I choose the migrate method because it's a good demo, but I could have disabled anything at that point, right? So what I do now is I'll run the exploit and then I migrate to win init process. So what I'll do is I'll put the PID of that process here. I'll show you via TCP view. So you can see that the win init process is PID 388, right? And it's listing on 49152 port. So I'll do systhread ID 388, right? And I run my exploit. No blue screen, that's a good sign. So I wake up the port in case it's sleeping, and then reverse byte check. Who am I? I'm system. It's total compromise from the sandbox. The sandbox has been completely breached, right? So if I do task kill now, see, I could not kill task notepad, but there you go. Right, task kill note. Task kill. Ah, I put an extra L. There you go. Right? Although at this time, this is the best time to disable your antivirus. I would recommend that. After this, you have kernel compromise, so switch off your antivirus at this point. Not a notepad, I'm sure. Right? So this is the sandbox point done. So what happened was, so when we did this, so this is what I did at Black Hat Europe, right? So, and then people said that, how serious is this? How big is this problem? So this was, I did it in March in Amsterdam, Black Hat Europe. That time there were only 30-40 vulnerabilities on the kernel, but as of now there are 73 kernel patches from Microsoft already till September. So if I were a stockbroker, I could see the chart looking pretty nice in terms of kernel exploits and patches, right? So, and there have been exploits found in the wild, like DoQ, and I'm sure there'll be many more which actually exploit kernel vulnerabilities, because once you have a good, reliable kernel exploit, it kind of breaks out of everything you have on the endpoint. right? So it's a large attack surface. It is a serious problem, and all of these sandboxes cannot fix this issue. This is a design issue of these sandboxes, right? So this is the new stuff, and this hasn't been disclosed publicly. I mean, I would say in a presentation, although we published a white paper around Black Hat time. So when I did my talk in Black Hat Europe, people came back and said, you know what? Kernel exploits are a little bit tougher to write. How many people can write kernel exploits? There are only few kernel exploits. How much malware is there for kernel exploits, right? I'm like, okay, so let's see what else is possible, right? So we sat down and looked at all the user mode components. As you might be remembering, in the earlier slide I said the user mode and kernel mode. So now we'll keep the kernel mode ponies for resting, sleeping for a while, and let's wake up the user mode stuff, right? So then we sat down and analyzed all of the sandboxes from a network connectivity, like what is possible in a sandbox process. Pretty much everything is possible on the TCP/IP side, right? If, for instance, a vulnerability in TCP/IP stack, I can pretty much break out of any of these sandboxes. Similarly, although Google has created a lot of restrictions on what is allowed and not allowed out of these sandboxes as well. So Google has hardened this even further more than anybody else again. And so if you do an RPC dump on localhost, you will see on a Windows 7 machine, latest patch machine today, you will see that there are 18 registered RPC services which are listening on that port, right? So which means that a vulnerability in any of these services is an attack surface, right? So, and not just that, even properly functioning code could be abused. And this is something which very few people know about, right? This is serious stuff. So before I talk about the exploitation part, I just want to mention about ALPC port. I don't know how many of you are aware of ALPC port. It's basically the advanced local procedure calls. They are a low-level mechanism used for inter-process communication on the Windows OS. So many services listen on these ports. Any vulnerability in these services means a sandbox escape. It's a perfect sandbox escape vector, I would say. And the type A sandboxes like Sandboxes are pretty open to all of these, right? By design. I mean, there's no exclusion to that rule. So we sat down and looked at, okay, so now let's find some nice exploits to bypass these. Now that we know that this is the attack surface, right? And then if you look at Adobe Reader versus Chrome, Adobe Reader has some very interesting services which listening on the localhost port. Did you see that, alsas.exe? Just imagine I send you a PDF document which brute forces your alsas and gets your local credentials, and I wouldn't be even breaking the sandbox there. That's a serious issue. I'm sure this will get broken very, very soon. So anyways, alsas is not the common denominator here. So we said, okay, we'll do as an exploiter, if you're writing exploits, you want to do the least amount of work, right? So the only thing which is common, which is interesting here, is CSRSS, which is common in Chrome, Adobe Reader, and all the type A sandboxes, right? So what we did is that we sat down and looked at all the vulnerabilities which have been patched in the last few years in CSRSS. And we came across this very interesting vulnerability, MS11063. It says, Microsoft Bulletin says this: the vulnerability is caused by CSRS's improperly validating permissions when a lower integrity process communicates a device event message to a high integrity process. That could mean that I can avoid writing an ROP-based shellcode, right? That sounds like an interesting one. So this exploit is not available public. Nobody has talked about it, but it was very, very intriguing. So we actually sat down. So you'll have to diff the patch, find the root cause, and then write an exploit for it. And this is exactly what we did. So we found out the root cause. It was pretty straightforward. It was actually pretty bad. The vulnerable versions of CSRSS performed no validation whatsoever, blindly executing post messages with all parameters controlled by the peer. Have you heard of shatter attacks? Shatter attacks, Redux. Ha ha. So when we actually found this, I was smiling that whole day. I just couldn't stop smiling. I'm like, really, 2011? Okay. So now it's time to bring back the pony, right? So what I do is, what I'll do first. I'll break out of Sandboxy, and then we'll break out of Google Chrome using the same exploit. So let's break out of Sandboxy first. So run any program sandboxed. I should have bought a license. Right, CMD. So as you can see, let me open Procmon. ProcEXP. Let me open ProcEXP. So now this is a very interesting, very cool exploit, and the fun part is that it's actually very serious. So as you can see, command prompt is running inside the sandbox. It has a hashtag. It's almost like being on Twitter all the time, huh? Hashtag for a sandbox process. Anyways, it has a hashtag, so it means that this is inside a sandbox with a hashtag, right? So now what I'll do is I'll run my exploit. So what I've done is that in this exploit, I break out of the sandbox and I inject into the command prompt which I open, and from there I can do pretty much anything. I don't know what to call it. I'm calling it remote keystroke injection, if that sounds good, right? So let me make it full screen. I run the exe and I'm writing on my command prompt out of the sandbox. Total compromise. And so after I start doing this, you can have evil thoughts like, how about I steal some data, right? So what I do is I log on via FTP to a remote server, right? And then I copy files called classified.doc. Game over. And all of this is on your host out of your sandbox, and your sandbox has no idea. It's just playing with the hashtags there. And I self-destruct. Total compromise. So that was breaching out of Sandboxy and other sandboxes of that category, right? So now I will break out of, let's do the same thing with Chrome. So the Chrome thing is a little bit different, right? So what I have to do here is, let me see. I have a video for this. So what we do is that, so we use the CV 2013-912 exploit, which was the SVG type confusion WebKit exploit, which was used by the MWR Labs guys to break out of Chrome Sandbox in the last Pontoon contest. And then instead of using the kernel exploit, we use the CSRSS to break out of Chrome, right? So what I'll do is that I'll start writing on that command prompt after I compromise Chrome, right? So that should be pretty cool. So you click on this, you do the exploit, and then I'm writing on the command prompt. Can you see that? Is it clear? So Chrome has been bypassed via CSRSS in this. Let's execute a Trojan. Yeah. And at this point, I have full access to the network share. I can do stuff like brute force your SMB. I can do lateral movement, basically, right? Yep. That is the bypass of all the sandboxes, pretty much using CSRSS. Okay, so the sandbox pony is pretty happy and satisfied at this point, right? So we have a detailed white paper. It's like 55 pages long, where we kind of break out of all of these sandboxes. It's available in this URL if you want to download it. And the interesting thing about this is that all the type A category sandbox, we kept our approach very clean. We did not break the sandbox. We escaped out of it by leveraging an operating system vulnerability. So what are the chances that even if you build the best sandbox on planet, there won't be a patch from Microsoft? So basically, Sandbox do not solve that problem, right? And it's a design issue. It's not something, one more fuzz vulnerability, one more CVE. These are all design fundamental issues. So definitely Google was far more harder. I had to leverage to CSRSS tactics, but we bypassed it as well. Although I would say they have done a lot of cool work, and I actually acknowledge them in the paper for that work, right? So then the other part is, so as we said, the definition of a sandbox early on is to contain exploit code or a Trojan or a malware, right? So which means that you expect malware inside a sandbox, right? And a lot of people do malware analysis in a sandbox, right? So then what we found is we created a new category called sandbox leakage, because we kind of stumbled onto this. What we found was, if I have a keylogger in a sandbox, just use your Metasploit interpreter. Don't break out of the sandbox. Just run a keylogger in the sandbox. I can sniff everything that's happening on your host. So if you have a malware on your sandbox, it can see whatever is happening inside whatever you're doing. Your banking password, if it's in a different sandbox on your host operating system, right? Pretty much all the sandboxes were vulnerable to that. I could switch on your webcam remotely from the sandbox, and you have no idea about it. I can record, I can switch on the mic, record from the sandbox, and there is no prevention available. Hijack your clipboard, right? I have full access to the clipboard. None of the sandboxes protect you against that. I have full network access share from the sandbox. Can you believe that? That is really bad, right? I can do stuff like screen scraping, stealing files. Most of the sandbox actually block via hooking, the way I explained, the kernel mode driver. So they actually prevent some of that. So I didn't spend time, so I just gave it some benefit of doubt, saying it's hard, but I didn't really try very hard. But yeah, this is kind of a summary of what we found out of our research. And this was, I'm sure there's a lot more there. This category is like, there's a lot more stuff there, I'm sure, especially the LSAS one from Adobe Reader. That is bad, right? So when I did this, people came back and said, what about defense in depth? What if you put a sandbox in a sandbox? So I call it the clueless pony exploit, right? And I call it defense in depth indeed, right? So now what I do is I put Google Chrome inside Sandboxy, and then I bypass both. So let's see, Sandboxy control. Program, CMD. So, and then I run the web browser, which is Google Chrome, right? So exp. So now I open Process Explorer, and then as I explained earlier, can you see this? Yes, not bad. Where is Process Explorer? Oh, I have two Process Explorers. Let me kill one. So as you can see, Google Chrome has untrusted. That's a renderer process, which is the biggest attack surface, and this is what Google is trying to protect, right? So what I do now is I inject into the renderer, looking at creating an exploit scenario like the SVG type confusion vulnerability, and then I use the doQ exploit to break out of both the sandboxes at one time, right? So this is the sandbox. So I do injector, and the PID of this process, untrusted process, is 3700700, and then I inject the T2, which is the font processing, and then my exploit, right? So I'm injecting into the renderer, creating a scenario that the renderer is compromised, and from there onwards, I use the doQ exploit to bypass both the sandboxes, right? Let's see if it works. Calculator with a hashtag, that's cool, right? So yes, I compromised the sandbox and I broke out of everything. As you can see, the calculator has integrity medium, right? But I love the hashtag, yeah. And now, what I'll do is I will let me get reverse shell, right? You want to see reverse shell? Come on. 52. I wake up the port in case it's sleeping. 444. Total compromise. A sandbox in a sandbox. Epic fail. Thank you. So that was defense in depth indeed. Yeah. By the way, I'm trademarking this term, huh? I think this is really very useful in the near future. So, so basically, kind of to conclude, kind of a good image, right? So fundamentally, sandboxes are vulnerable to the operating system OS kernel vulnerability. So every time there's an OS kernel patch and you have a sandbox, you are not safe because you don't know who is using that exploit, right? As we found, and which is kind of not well known, is that there are user mode components which also can introduce sandbox escape vectors, right? So we'll probably talk more about this in the upcoming conferences, but this is a serious vector, which means that pretty much you have a large attack surface lying out there, right? And breaking out of a sandbox using an OS vulnerability is far better return on investment. At least it was for me. Simply because the sandboxes are tightly, Google has spent millions and millions of dollars of hardening the sandbox, but they cannot protect you against Microsoft, right? So I would say I would vote for, if you want to write an exploit for sandbox, find a vulnerability in the OS and then you leverage that to break out of the sandbox. I would say that is the future of how sandbox exploitation is going to happen in the future, right? And type A sandboxes, which are like generic containers, I mean, I would say it doesn't make any sense anymore. It made sense 5 years back when the exploitation industry was not that mature, but looking at where we are right now, the attack surface is huge. The amount of hardening required to limit the attack surface is just huge. It just doesn't make sense, right? So Chrome actually came out best sandbox from our analysis because it was far more difficult to break out of Chrome than anything else, because it is one application from Google on which they have spent millions of dollars. They have a very good security research team, right? Imagine, would it be possible to do that in a generic container? It's just not possible. It doesn't make sense, right? So I have some love for Chrome, although I bypass it, but there's some love there. And please don't do malware analysis in a sandbox. Use a VM or use something else. If you love sandboxes, put a sandbox inside a VM, but don't do malware analysis. Sandbox is a good product. It's made by one guy. I respect him for what he has done, but the days of analyzing malware in an application sandbox are over. Don't do that. You'll get compromised. And so, yeah, that's pretty much what I have. I would like to also acknowledge Rafael Wojcik, who actually worked with me on this research. We did the Presso at Black Hat, and I want to thank, without him, this wouldn't have been possible. And there's a lot of cool work which has been there. We acknowledge all the people who have done the cool sandbox research breakout. So, yeah, any questions? I'm kind of made it on time. Yeah. So VM uses a hypervisor, right? The question is, how is VM better than a sandbox, right? So a VM uses a hypervisor in which the attack surface is far less vulnerable than the application sandbox. And furthermore, if you use a proper VM, it gives you the full context of the OS, including the kernel. So a kernel vulnerability doesn't matter because it's in the VM, right? If you're testing and doing malware analysis inside a VMware workstation, you're probably fine compared to say Sandbox, right? So yes, I would say VM is, although VM escapes are possible, but they are far, far more difficult. It wouldn't be like a weekend project or like this, I would say. Thank you. Thank you.